I'm Brendan Gillott. I'm the third year Director of Studies in English, which means I oversee the work of the final year students, our undergraduate students, as they proceed towards the final part of their degree. But I teach students in all years of the course. So what I'd like to talk about today is this thing called practical criticism, which some of you may recognize this phrase, some of you may not, but as Naomi was saying, this is a core component of what we do here in Cambridge English. So, well, why have I chosen to talk about this today? The kind of straightforward answer to that is that practical criticism, or it's usually called, it's colloquially called Pratt Crit. It's the central and kind of core component, really, of our English degree here at Cambridge. It's the backbone and perhaps maybe the characteristic feature of how we teach and think about English literature. It's been part of the degree almost since our faculty's beginning, which was about a century ago. And it continues to be a regular exercise for our students today. So if you ask any current student of English corpus or around the university about their degree, they're sure to have something to say about Pratt Crit, and hopefully it's something positive. Maybe try that out later on. So what is practical criticism? At heart, it's really very simple. Practical criticism is just close reading, a careful and deliberate attention to the specificities of particular pieces of writing, to what get called texts. It's close reading which tries to figure out how those texts work, what they're doing, and whether they're doing it successfully or in a less than ideal manner. And it tries to make these arguments and judgments with reference to textual detail. It uses close reading, in other words, as a kind of, it's like a mode of evidence gathering. So practical criticism is criticism insofar as it is fundamentally concerned with interpretation and with evaluation. So what does this poem do? What does it say? And how does it do that? And is it, in the end of the day, any good as a poem? It's practical, this term practical is used because we ask students not to rely on the reputation of an author or a text, or on any historical contexts which they may know, or on regurgitated popular opinion, on things that people often say about writers when they come to their judgments and practical criticism. We ask them instead to look at what is actually on the page in front of them and to make their arguments about texts based on that evidence and on their own personal readings, insights, and sense of what is valuable in reading. So in a kind of narrow sense, you'll probably already have been doing Pratt Crit. So when you study a novel or a poem or a play in school or in college, you will have picked up or picked out certain sections or passages of those poems or plays or novels, which seem to you to be of special interest. And you will have gone into them more deeply, observing how they create a particular effect for their reader in some maybe quite small or detailed ways, maybe at the level even of one word or even one syllable of a word, and trying to work out how that detail interacts with its neighbours or with something else in a previous paragraph or another part of the stanza or of the novel. You may well have come across the term close reading to describe this behaviour. Rather than worrying about the higher level phenomena of a text like character or plot or theme, you begin with the building blocks of a piece of writing, trying to understand how these small parts work together to create larger effects, like a compelling narrative or an intriguing character, or a thought-provoking reflection on some great issue or other. So practical criticism, like all close reading, is meant to explain how the overall picture of a literary work emerges out of its details. If this aspect of close reading will be, I think, basically familiar to anyone who's made any serious study of literature, it's nonetheless the case, I think, that the version of close reading we call practical criticism here at Cambridge has some unique features. Perhaps most famously, Pratt Crit almost always concerns unseen texts, so-called unseen texts. That is to say, pieces of writing which you as a student will probably not previously have studied, and whose authors you may never have come across. In fact, in many cases, in certain cases, you won't even be told who the author is or when the piece in question was written. Those sorts of questions or concerns will be left up to your own kind of surmise or investigation. So you'll be expected to rely on your wits, on your broad reading of many different types and periods of writing, and on your own knowledge of how literary texts in the round tend to work in order to come to a sense of what is going on in a given poem or an extract from a play. So generally speaking, Pratt Crit, it's a running theme of the Cambridge English students' itinerary of study. This varies a bit, but most likely students will meet with their practical criticism supervisor every week in small groups of about a handful, so sort of 3 to 4 is normal. And they'll do so throughout all 3 years of undergraduate study. This is the course, the paper, which sort of continues regardless of what's going on around it, what other things you're studying at the same time. So the usual pattern is that the supervisor will circulate reading a few days in advance, maybe a week in advance, and they'll expect the students to come to the supervision, to the class, having read through those texts which have been circulated very carefully and probably multiple times, with an eye to discussing with the group, sharing ideas and comparing different interpretations and judgments. Again, this varies a bit, but the reading that's set for a given session, it's usually comparative. There's usually 2 or sometimes 3 literary texts, and these can be of any kind or period. And this kind of exercise in comparison will expect you to draw connections and to mark differences between how the texts under discussion work. So some weeks there may also be additional, what we usually call theoretical reading, usually a longer passage, enabling us to discuss how some famous critic of the past or a scholar goes about their business, or to discuss the ideas of a literary theorist, someone who thinks about these kind of great questions of what, why, and when with literature, to talk about those ideas on a broader question of how reading and writing and what is called literature kind of work in general. So this paper is usually referred to as practical criticism, but its official title is Practical Criticism and Critical Practice, a sort of mirroring gesture, where the critical practice indicates this theoretical side, this thinking about, well, what is it we're doing when we're doing literary criticism, when we're thinking about literary texts? What's the point and how ought it to function? So in the supervision, the supervisor may guide the session by setting a question or a theme to think about as you read through the work, or they may simply offer the texts with no comment and expect students to make what they can out of what they're given. I should say at this point that there are various kinds of approaches to teaching Pratt Crit, and the version I'm giving here is, I suppose, my own preferred method, but you may find other people doing other things. So occasionally a supervisor may not set reading in advance of the class and simply bring copies of texts along to the supervision and have students just sort of go at it completely unprepared. Sometimes they'll get students to read out the work in the class, to kind of listen to it. There's all kinds of different ways of doing it. Different teachers have different approaches, and they may switch between those approaches as they see fit. But nonetheless, in the supervisions, the discussion is meant to be one between equals, and the supervisor will most likely claim no special expertise on the texts that she or he has set. Their job is to facilitate the conversation, to challenge or provoke ideas and arguments, and most importantly, perhaps, to push students to make the most precise and compelling version of their own arguments, to provide the strongest version of their own cases. So whilst supervisors will often set reading which is close to their own research interests, they needn't always, and quite often supervisors enjoy, in this paper, supervising on material which is quite a long way away from their normal academic interests, from the normal material that they teach on. Practical criticism is meant to be fun, and part of the fun is encountering things that maybe you're not entirely familiar with and having to work through it together. So that's the supervision pattern. There are also essays for Pratt Crit. There's a written component as well as the discussed component. So every few weeks, again, this depends on the supervisor, it depends on the stage of study, but about every few weeks, the supervisor will set texts and they'll set a question and ask students to spend about an hour writing an answer to that question. So these essays, I think they can seem alarming to students at first. You're just kind of given some pieces of writing and told to go at it. But my experience is students, they quickly get into the swing of this, and in fact, quite quickly become kind of practiced masters of this kind of sensitive, immediate literary critical response. And all of this discussion and writing practice adds up towards examinations and practical criticism, in which students will be expected to write 3 essays on unseen texts in about 3 hours. These exams are held, there's 2 of them, they're held at the end of the first year of study, which we usually call Part 1A, and the end of the 3rd and final year, which is called Part 2, rather confusingly. And these examinations form a key component of how students are assessed for the degree. I think for a lot of people, these tests are in fact a highlight. These exams are in fact a highlight of their time as English students. They offer the ability to show off all that you've learned over 3 years of study, for students to show all their strengths as critics and indeed their kind of personal style and flair, particularly in the final year. We get responses to exam questions which are really surprising and impressive in terms of their kind of critical acumen and swagger. Okay, so that's very broadly how the pattern of teaching and study works for Pratt Crit as a component of the English degree. I want to move very quickly onto this, onto a question of the history of practical criticism and why it matters so much to us in this particular faculty, in this particular department. So I'm going to try and explain that via a very brief, hopefully very brief excursus into the history of practical criticism. So the term practical criticism, it emerged in Cambridge in around the 1920s. And at around the time that the Faculty of English was founded. So the history of the Faculty of English is quite complicated, but it initially was a subcategory of the Modern and Medieval Languages Department. It was founded as a sort of course you could take within Modern and Medieval Languages in 1914. But in 1926, it became its own distinct faculty, its own distinct department, within which you could do a whole degree in English. So yeah, 1926. Practical criticism as a phrase and as a discipline was the invention of a fella called I.A. Richards. There's a picture of him there. He was one of the first members of our faculty and in fact, a crucial figure in the early history of academic literary study more generally. He's well known far beyond Cambridge. That picture of him there, he's sat on the peak of one of the Alps. He was, as well as being an important literary critic, he was also a quite accomplished mountaineer. So Richards was originally a philosopher. His first academic training was in philosophy, but he became increasingly interested in literature, and he began offering supervisions to Cambridge students on English language authors and English language texts. So he was doing this before there was an English department. And rather amusingly, because there was no official structure for these supervisions, students had to pay Richards at the door, kind of like entering a movie theatre. So at the time, so this was in the 1910s, the study of what gets called vernacular literature, so literature in non-classical languages, this study of vernacular literature was in its infancy. And to some degree, it was actually looked down upon as insufficiently intellectually serious and rigorous in comparison to more well-established disciplines like Latin and ancient Greek and Sanskrit and so on. But around Britain, and indeed around the rest of the world, but focus on Britain here, around Britain, there were various attempts to found departments for the academic study of English literature, that is vernacular literature. But in order to do so, it was felt that there would need to be the development of a method, which is to say a set of systematic approaches, which would set the new study of English on a securer intellectual basis than was usually associated with literary criticism at the time. The literary criticism of the 19th century has its virtues, but it tends to be kind of quite high-handed and impressionistic. It's a tendency to say, you know, well, as we all know, Milton was a great soul, that kind of thing. And this didn't seem like it was a promising basis for the establishment of a serious academic discipline. So the people who wanted to set up English as a department, they had to find a method, you know, a kind of way of approaching the subject. And Richards set himself to that task. In 1929, he published a book entitled Practical Criticism, or a Study of Literary Judgment, which you can see a picture of a rather tatty first edition on the right there. So Richard's Practical Criticism, it was an unusual book by the standards of lit crit. It was experimental, not only in that it suggested new ways of studying and teaching literature, but in that it actually took the form of a kind of sociological experiment. So Richards got together a group of about 20 undergraduates and presented them with 13 unseen poems, whose authors, dates, and contexts were entirely removed. And Richards, in this book, he asks each of the students to write a brief essay on each of the 13 poems. He calls these essays protocols. It's a rather strange word, but what they are in essence is very brief 2 or 3 paragraph essays where the students attempt to make what they can of the poems that they've been presented with, to say, in essence, what they thought they meant, whether they liked them, whether they thought they were good or bad poems. And Richard's view, in the book, he accounts for all these different responses, and then he kind of analyzes them. In effect, he kind of responds to the responses. In his view, this whole exercise was a disaster. In the book, Richards kind of goes through the responses poem by poem, and for the most part, he bewails the failures of understanding and what he calls construal, which he finds even among this fairly well-educated group of essay writers. I mean, these are not necessarily underprivileged kids, you know, in the 1920s Cambridge. These are very much the children of the wealthy and the elite. But even they seem, you know, having had the best education that money and love can buy, they seem to Richards not to be terribly good at reading poetry. So what Richards outlines in the final section of this book, Practical Criticism, are a set of characteristic failings on the part of the poetry readers of his day, or what he thinks are characteristic failings. So he's got various sort of subcategories for these failings, but the important ones, I think, are what he calls presupposition. So things people simply assume must be true of the poems they were reading, and they assumed before they'd actually read the poems. They'd sort of projected ideas onto the poems. He talks about the problem of inhibition, which is in essence a lack of confidence in one's own judgment, a lack of belief that one has the sort of ability or even right to judge poetry. And the third and perhaps most important problem he identifies, he calls stock responses. And stock responses, in essence, are the act of saying that a poem must be good because it reminds the reader of someone famous, you know, a famous poet like Shakespeare or Emily Dickinson or William Wordsworth. So if it reminds you of someone famous, then it must therefore be good. All of these faults, Richards believed, were a result of limited practice in reading poetry. and a subsequent inability to really see what was on the page in front of you. His educational solution to these problems was the activity now called practical criticism, a method of teaching and testing skills and developing sensitivity in reading, which would encourage profounder and more attentive understanding of literary works through detailed analysis of short text passages, often presented with no information about author, date of composition, or the place of the passage within the work it was taken from. So you can, in practical criticism, receive excerpts from, say, novels, which might be taken right from the middle of a novel you haven't read, and that poses certain kinds of challenges, as I'm sure you can imagine. So this is more or less the method that Richards had tried out on his volunteers, on his test subjects. And it was his view that, repeated and made a central pole of a degree program, it would develop more precise powers of prescription and description in students, more precise powers of diagnosis and of critical judgment, and produce readers who were sensitive, knowledgeable, and able, perhaps most importantly, able to substantiate their views on literature in a manner approaching a science. This idea of the scientificity of literary criticism is quite popular in the early 20th century. It's a somewhat more debated idea today, though it still has its defenders. So practical criticism has been a required paper for all English undergraduates in Cambridge ever since. It shares that distinction with the papers on tragedy, the third-year paper on tragedy, and the first-year paper on Shakespeare. All students have to take those papers, and all students always have had to take those papers. So those some aspects of how practical criticism works have been changed in the last sort of 100 years. For example, it's no longer as poetry centered as it was in Richard's day. We now look at all kinds of different written materials. And equally, it's no longer a requirement that texts be anonymized. They sometimes are, but they aren't always. Despite these changes, the core purpose and vision for Pratt Crit remain as they were when Richards laid them down. And in many ways, I think we in the faculty think of practical criticism as the sort of signature of our degree, as its kind of calling card. So hopefully this should give you some sense of why we put so much emphasis on this aspect of our English course. The Cambridge English degree is meant to be a conspectus covering all English language literature, at least a bit, in between about 1300 AD, there and thereabouts, and the present day. So texts studied in practical criticism can be drawn from any part of this huge period and be of any number of kinds, from fiction and poetry through to journalism, non-fiction, and song lyrics. In principle, all study in other parts of the course will feed into Pratt Crit. As students become more familiar with medieval alliterative verse or the 19th century realist novel, as examples, they'll find it easier to identify these tendencies and deviations from those tendencies in the unseen texts they encounter in practical criticism. But the influence also goes the other way. I think this is crucial, really. The repeated practice of close attention to the detail of texts learned in Pratt Crit will form the basis of all reading done towards the other areas of study. And most essays written by our students have their core or kernel in a close Pratt Crit-like reading of some text or section of text. So in many ways, practical criticism is the kind of, you can think of it as the basic skill we hope to inculcate, a type of special care taken with literary objects, which is meant not only to produce good outcomes in academic study, but also to create truly sensitive, knowledgeable, and critical readers and thinkers who will take those abilities into all manner of future endeavours and many avenues of life. Okay, so in this second half of the talk, I want to try and give an impression of what a Pratt Crit reading might look like. I circulated, and I hope you all saw, a couple of poems in advance of this morning. So Marianne Moore's When I Buy Pictures, Frank O'Hara's Having a Coke with You. So what follows is an attempt, and I want to emphasize attempt here. I always find the actual writing of Pratt Crit quite difficult, and it is a difficult practice. But what follows is an attempt on my behalf to read those poems, to read them comparatively, and to indicate the sorts of things that the practical critic might look out for and might do. My intention is to stick as closely as possible to what's on the page, to the evidence presented there, and to try to avoid too much reference to speculated contexts or exterior meanings. So let's read through the poems first. Hopefully you can see the text is big enough for you to see there. When I buy pictures, or what is closer to the truth, when I look at that of which I may regard myself as the imaginary possessor, I fix upon what would give me pleasure in my average moments. The satire upon curiosity in which no more is discernible than the intensity of the mood, or quite the opposite, the old thing, the medieval decorated hat box, in which there are hounds with waists diminishing like the waist of the hourglass, and deer and birds and seated people. It may be no more than the square of parquetry, the literal biography perhaps, in letters standing well apart upon a parchment-like expanse, in artichokes, in 6 varieties of blue, the snipe-legged hieroglyphic in 3 parts, the silver fence protecting Adam's grave, or Michael taking Adam by the wrist. Too stern an intellectual emphasis upon this quality or that detracts from one's enjoyment. It must not wish to disarm anything, nor may the approved triumph easily be honoured. That which is great because something else is small. It comes to this: of whatever sort it is, it must be lit with the piercing glances into the life of things. It must acknowledge the spiritual forces which have made it. So that's Marianne Moore. And then Frank O'Hara, or I think pronounce it O'Hara, but Frank O'Hara's Having a Coke with You. Having a Coke with you is even more fun than going to San Sebastian, Irun, Endai, Biarritz, Bayonne, or being sick to my stomach on the Travesera de Gracia in Barcelona, partly because in your orange shirt you look like a better, happier Saint Sebastian, partly because of my love for you, partly because of your love for yogurt, partly because of the fluorescent orange tulips around the birches, partly because of the secrecy our smiles take on before people and statuary. It's hard to believe when I'm with you that there could be anything as still, as solemn, as unpleasantly definitive as statuary, when right in front of it, in the warm New York 4 o'clock light, we are drifting back and forth between each other like a tree breathing through its spectacles. And the portrait show seems to have no faces in it at all, just paint. You suddenly wonder why in the world anyone ever did them. I look at you, and I would rather look at you than all the portraits in the world, except possibly for the Polish rider occasionally, and anyway, it's in the Frick, which thank heavens you haven't gone to yet, so we can go together for the first time. And the fact that you move so beautifully more or less takes care of futurism. Just as at home, I never think of the nude descending a staircase, or at a rehearsal, a single drawing of Leonardo or Michelangelo that used to wow me. And what good does all the research of the Impressionists do them when they never got the right person to stand near the tree when the sun sank? Or for that matter, Marino Marini, when he didn't pick the rider as carefully as the horse. It seems they were all cheated of some marvelous experience, which is not going to go wasted on me, which is why I'm telling you about it. I think with the O'Hara, it should be pronounced yogurt, again, because he's an American, but I just couldn't bring myself to say it. So, where can we begin our Pratt Crit reading of these 2 texts? The best place to start, I think, is with the obvious things. Practical criticism can become a recondite, even obscure practice in its readings and inquiries, but it's always best place or best practice to begin with what seems basic and unavoidable. So, some basic things. Both texts are short poems, bordering perhaps on lyric. Both appear in one way or another to be concerned with artworks, with a view on art more generally. Both operate with what we might call a loose conception of poetic form, owing something perhaps to the so-called free verse of the early 20th century. What this means for us, initially, is that we shouldn't expect to find the kinds of verse patterns inherited from the 16th or 17th or 18th centuries, so say the sonnet or the ode. We needn't bother looking for complex rhyme schemes or any rhyme at all necessarily. And we needn't try to count the lines as either accumulating into a traditional form, so famously 14 lines for a sonnet in most cases, or to count the lines internally, adding them up as a set of metrical units. We could, I suppose, try to count syllables and imply feet into each line, but I think it would be inappropriate in this context. I don't think it would tell us much of any interest. These are poems which look to make their own form as they continue, rather than following a received pattern. And they owe more to an admittedly questionable or dubious ideal of real speech than to the song-like mannerisms of earlier times and earlier poetic styles. Line breaks fall where they will, and certain effects of emphasis and undercutting may be implied by these line breaks. So as a result, line lengths vary, though they tend here to be long, and this sense of expansiveness might be something to keep in mind, or keep in the back of the mind at least, as we continue. There's another perhaps obvious initial similarity. Both poems enter from their titles, including the title as a sort of pseudo first line. When I buy pictures, or what is closer to the truth? Having a Coke with you is more fun than going to all these places. This sort of technique of using the title as a first line, it's sometimes called an incipit or incipit run-on, but I don't think there's an established technical term for it. But both titles thus pull a kind of double duty, locating or establishing a scenario for the poem, sort of telling us where we are and what we're doing. But they also begin the poem, giving both that, and they giving both poems that feigned sense of actual speech, of being spoken to. We may notice, however, that the relationship between the title and the first line in each poem, it actually suggests, I think, significant kind of differences. Moore's poem immediately contradicts itself, or what is closer to the truth. So as if the title is in fact somehow untrue. And as a result, actually, it's the third line, if we're counting the title as the first line, the third line, when I look at that of which I may regard myself as the imaginary possessor, which becomes a kind of alternative title. Whereas the ahara drops in more smoothly and contiguously with that assertive is, having a Coke with you is even more fun. We can then feel a difference in tone, even at this early stage. Ahara's text posing something definitive and sure of itself, reaching out optimistically, while Moore's poem is immediately of more than one mind, contorting around its own expressions and querying its own thoughts. Broadly speaking, we might mark this difference in tone, I think, throughout the poems. Having a Coke with you is convivial. It's a poem of imagined conversation, full of everyday expressions and I think a kind of subtle humor. Thank heavens you haven't gone to it yet, so we can go together for the first time. That thank heavens here, it's both a sort of everyday demotic expression one might kind of not expect to find in a poem, but it's also rather kind of pointedly over the top. It's a sort of sly winking to the reader. Thank heavens. That sort of archness is perhaps most notable in what I think is a really quite funny wow in that sort of second stanza, which I don't know, it's full of kind of witty excess and carefully balanced ironies. I like to think who gets away with saying wow in a poem, and it might be only Frank O'Hara gets away with it. The poem works to create a sense of interpersonal dialogue, the O'Hara. Its two marked pronouns are you and I, and they kind of recruit us, that is the readers, into the poem's conversation by way of implying that we might be you, so to speak. This is actually a common modern lyric trick, to sort of have this second person address, this you, which seems to kind of pull us, the reader, into the poem. Though, of course, that you could be read another way, as an exclusive gesture towards a you who is exactly not us, but is rather someone specific and known to the poet, perhaps, a friend who shares an in-joke that we can't quite see or can't quite include it in. So we're tempted perhaps to read O'Hara's I as indeed the I of O'Hara, but equally the I could be just one, the indifferent voice of poetry itself. Or, as ever with a lyric poem, I could be the reader. We take on the position and the feeling of the speaker. So all of these things are possibilities, and it's the ability to multiply persons and perspectives in his poem, to populate it voluminously and sort of indeterminately, which to my mind most powerfully conveys what I'm calling here O'Hara's conviviality. Moore, on the other hand, works with only a me and an I as pronouns, and there's also a carefully kind of non-committal one. Here, reflecting internally, the speaker of the poem mulls over their own perceptions of art objects and of questions of value, trying to create a conversation not between different speakers, but of different thoughts and feelings in one's own head. The manner in Moore is thus very different to that in O'Hara, however superficially similar their verse may seem. Moore's lines are more convoluted than convivial. They're kind of bathed in reversals and addenda, pointed in various directions by this profusion of punctuation. Whereas in contrast, O'Hara's more free-flowing piece is almost entirely unpunctuated, the line endings themselves providing the only real guide to a reading aloud. Moore's poem is full of negations. No more is discernible, no more than the square of parquetry, not wish, nor may, quite the opposite, all these negations, lending it an uncertain and kind of labyrinthine quality, perhaps best seen in that third line I earlier said might function as the poem's real title, when I look at that of which I may regard myself as the imaginary possessor. This is a kind of complex phrase. It's quite a mouthful. It's hard to actually follow intellectually, I think. The array of different prepositions, so of, which, as, and so on, these point us in kind of many different directions at once. It's easy to be confused here. So Moore's is a poem about the internal life, the life of the mind, if you like, or of private feeling. But it's one which is unsteady and undecided in its judgments or feelings on art, or at least spends a lot of its time being undecided and unsteady, needing to work these out painfully as it goes on. The O'Hara, on the other hand, kind of revels in its sociability, its outgoing charm, which makes us feel like the you address, the kind of part of the gang. So each poem I've suggested addresses itself to an experience of art. Each proposes a certain kind of image of what it might be like to look at or consider an artwork. But again, there are significant differences here. Moore's poem appeals to what's called the ekphrastic tradition in writing, that is, writing which describes the detail of works of art. It's a Greek term, ekphrasis. It was originally used to mean any kind of passage of rich description, but in more modern times, it's come to mean specifically description of works of art. Moore gives us a set of depictions of what's referred to as a medieval hat box. And these descriptions seem quite concrete and fulsome, tracing the lines of the decorating images with an attention to how poetry's preferred techniques can render an unpresent. So we obviously can't actually see the object here. The object isn't present to us. But there's a particular attention to how poetry's techniques can render that image tangible. I think simile is very notable here, this kind of logic of likeness. The waists of the dogs, like the waists of an hourglass, the paint-bearing words on what looks like parchment, gives a sort of tangibility to this non-present image. But this tangibility is undercut by the characteristic sort of swerving of this poem's line of thought. What we have here are several possible objects listed together as if to suggest some sort of continuity. But this is not in fact the case. There are options, possibilities the poem imagines but does not settle on. Its details are purely notional. In place of this vagary, we do not even know if Moore's hat box is real. We don't know if she's thinking of a real hat box. O'Hara knows his paintings, he knows his painters, and he demonstrates his knowledge at some length. His poem is almost a gallery catalogue in itself, naming artists and artworks at the drop of a hat. The whole poem is characterized by its listing, in fact, whether that be a potential holiday places, works of art we might see together, ways in which spending time with you is so much fun. This gives O'Hara's poem a concrete, placed quality, which is kind of repeatedly allowed to escape the Moore. But the very nature of O'Hara's list perhaps makes this concreteness sort of ambiguous in itself. The list of names of artists and artworks suggests, of course, a kind of familiarity, a set of names and references that we both know, again, like friends or old acquaintances. But it also minimizes their significance, lavishing none of the attention with which Moore depicts her virtual hat box. It suggests a kind of offhandedness, which shades almost into a kind of dismissal. The artworks and artists have been, quote, cheated of some marvelous experience. This is a people poem, the O'Hara poem. And, quote, the portrait show seems to have no faces in it at all, just paint. The statues are solemn and unpleasantly definitive, but this poem is neither solemn nor definitive. Actual artworks, the artworks themselves, are in fact sort of subtly excluded from this poem. Artworks can't share in what O'Hara calls the secrecy our spiles take on before people and statuary. You and I may know about art, but art doesn't know about us. It doesn't know anything, it's just paint, after all. And that, this poem says, is what I'm telling you about. The attitude to art is thus quite different in each poem. For more, to look at a work of art is to engage in an internal struggle. If we return to that important third line, when I look at that of which I may regard myself as the imaginary possessor, we can see it is not an artwork we're really looking at, but ourselves. I may regard myself, not just any old hat box. For O'Hara, on the other hand, to think about or look at art is to think of how it might be shared, how art viewing might flow through a kind of social medium. Ultimately, it might be to wish one wasn't looking at art at all, but rather kind of bunking off and having fun with your friends. What we know, what we see, what we experience is so much more than what can be contained in a picture or even in one's own head. The best example of this thought can be found, I think, in the strange and striking image which ends O'Hara's first stanza. In the warm New York 4 o'clock light, we are drifting back and forth between each other like a tree breathing through its spectacles. So what on earth could that mean? It's hard to imagine a tree breathing through its spectacles. Indeed, it's probably something that couldn't be made into a visual image at all. And perhaps that's the point. The painters couldn't depict this. And maybe I alone can't quite imagine it, can't quite make an image of it in my head. But drifting back and forth between each other, as we are in these lines, enjoying each other's company, maybe it makes a kind of sense. Finally, I could argue that on a closer inspection, neither poem is really about art at all, appearances notwithstanding. Moore's poem is about the self, I, me, and the complexities of what occurs in my mind when I try to think, when I try to come to a sense of value, when I try to make judgments. O'Hara's poem, in an almost opposite sense, is about sharing and communality. It is, so to speak, about you, a you that the poem would rather look at than all the portraits in the world. Okay, so I'll leave it there. Of course, this is by no means the only way of looking at or reading these poems or of understanding them. And Pratt Crit's meant to provide detailed but personal responses, not dubiously correct or complete ones. So you may have seen other things in these two great poems, and you may indeed disagree with what it is I see. But hopefully the preceding talk gives you a sense of what Pratt Crit allows you to say and do, and of what it might be like to study it at Cambridge. So thanks very much, and I'll hand over to Naomi.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Brendan. That was really, really interesting. I thoroughly enjoyed that. So we'd invite people now to put questions into the Q&A box. You should be able to type questions in there. So any questions you want to ask Brendan about practical criticism, the content of the exploration he did on the two poems, anything along those lines, we'll just pause for a second to give people a chance to type their questions. Or about, the course. You could also ask Brendan questions about the course now, although there will be an opportunity again for that later this afternoon. So we've got the first questions come in is, what type of format do the essays usually take? So I think this is probably generally speaking in Cambridge.
Well, so the format is, it's a bit hard to kind of lay down a single law on this. Different papers will ask you to write in slightly different ways. So the Pratt Crit essays are very close attention focused, for example. Whereas in some of the more historical papers, you might be expected to talk more about history. In some of the more theoretical papers, you might be expected even to write essays about philosophy on occasion, depending on what you're interested in. And all those require different approaches. But I think it's also worth saying that one of the things we as teachers, we as supervisors are interested in is trying to encourage you to develop as a student your own style and your own way of approaching critical writing. So it's not that anything goes, but there's more than one way to succeed. The essays, it might be that, we expect a certain kind of length. So an amount of writing appropriate to a week, somewhere in between 1.5 and 2,000 words is normal. If you write a sort of 10,000 word epic, you might actually annoy your supervisor, who obviously has to read it. I've had that experience a few times. But there are no hard and fast rules. The essays you're usually given a week to write them, though, and that does set a certain kind of frame in which you can work, I guess.
Thanks. And that kind of leads on to probably our next question, which is, would we be expected to form those judgments after a first reading or discussion of texts, or would we do that after looking at them after a longer period of time? And I think, again, that probably depends, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. My sense of this is that usually your first impression is worth following up. So your first sort of judgment, you're sort of, oh, I like this. Oh, this isn't for me. One of the things we might be trying to encourage you to do in Pratt Crit is not to sort of necessarily question your own responses, but to try and understand why it is you feel like that, right? And to go into, further readings to try and explain to yourself and explain to other people why it is you find a particular passage from a novel really, interesting or beautiful, or, find it very ugly and uninteresting, perhaps. Yeah.
Thank you. Next, how much value do you think should be placed on the writer's intention of writing, and should we look for the writer's historical context to judge a piece of literature?
Yeah, no, this is an old classic question, isn't it? It's a good question. To some degree, I think it depends. I'm going to say non-committally. I think sometimes we just can't know what is meant, what's intended, so to speak. Sometimes we can. Sometimes it's obvious, right? So I think it's a case-by-case basis. And one of the things, again, that Pratt Crit encourages students to do is treat different texts, different authors on a case-by-case basis. In terms of thinking about historical context, it can be useful, obviously. But there's, again, multiple ways, I think, to read and multiple ways to read successfully. So it's not always the case that we need to understand, I don't know, if we're reading George Eliot, that we need to understand something about the Corn Laws of the 19th century. It may help us to understand certain aspects of that novel, but there are other things to get out of it. Yeah. It's a matter of approach, and really a matter of, some of our students like that historical approach and lean on it. Others prefer something slightly different. And this is what we mean when we say we want to encourage you to develop your own style and your own way of doing things.
That's the beauty of the course, isn't it? Is there's so much flexibility to go down the sort of the direction that you want to go down with it. So somebody's asked a specific question to do with the O'Hara poem. I was wondering what the structural gap before I look at you in the second stanza of the poem and after as a horse suggests.
Sorry, let me get it out. Yeah, so I have various versions of what I might say about this. Part of me thinks that O'Hara is quite a gestural poet, by which I mean that he one of the things that we might say, to bring in a bit of context, is the guy actually works in an art gallery, right? So he does really know his paintings. And my sense is that he has this sort of sense that you might throw a word on the page like you might throw a color on a canvas, and that the place of it doesn't mean anything as such, but it's part of a kind of overall look or kind of dynamic, a sense of movement which the poem has. So I don't think that it's the case that we can necessarily read a definite semantic meaning into this particular line break or this particular sort of, because it's a very short line, isn't it? But we can maybe, this is going to sound very vague, but I think it's partly about a vibe. And a kind of sense of a particular kind of sense of movement and a sense of how we're moving through the space of the poem. That would be my or one of my answers.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Quite a few questions coming up around, are you expected to know how to do Pratt Crit before you start university? Does this come up in the interview? Are you tested it on it in the interview? There are quite a few questions around this area.
Short answer, no. Right, we expect you to pick it up as you go along. Obviously, once students get here, but we're not expecting a particular set of skills. As I kind of said in the talk, it seems kind of probable to me that most of you will have done something not entirely unlike this in your GCSEs, in your A levels or IB or whatever it is you're doing. That kind of close attention thing. So you already have some of these tools. But we're not expecting you to come already like genius level Pratt critters, right? We kind of expect you to come as you are. In terms of the admissions process, there is a tendency to have an unseen text in the interviews, or in at least one of the interviews, which you'll probably be given like half an hour in advance of the interview beginning, and then that'll just form the basis of discussion. But it's a rather different thing from a normal Pratt Crit supervision, because usually in a Pratt Crit supervision, there's several students and one supervisor, whereas in the interview, there's usually two supervisors and one student. So it's a slightly different kind of thing. And it's not a decisive component of what we're testing for. We just want to give you something concrete to talk about, right?
Exactly. Thank you. Thinking about preparing for practical criticism and learning about it, are there any books that you could recommend that students of this sort of age group read at this point if they want to learn a bit more about it?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, I'm going to recommend Practical Criticism by Richards, which is it's a pretty dry book. I don't know if it's a good read. It's an interesting book for boring people like me. So the book that I would recommend, right, there's a book called, let me just get it.
Of course.
Some of you may have come across this, I don't know, some of you won't have. This book, The Poetry Handbook by John Leonard. It might be in the 3rd edition now. I think this is out of date. But this has it'll be useful for anybody interested in poetry, anybody who's having to work on poetry for their A-levels, for example. It gives you a set of really helpful things to look at when reading poems. And it's actually useful not just for reading poems, but for reading any type of text. It has a really interesting, for example, section on how to read rhythm in prose. That would be, I think, my number one pick. And it's meant to be a sort of student handbook, so it's fairly approachable.
That's really, really helpful to have that recommendation. Thank you. Next question I'm going to pick out. When you're analysing an unseen text, what's your advice on? So first of all, you make sure you understand both the texts, and what's your advice? What do you do next?
Part of me wants to say it's not so clear to me that you always understand the text and read them. I still think there's aspects of both those poems that I don't understand. I would say that, and this is the advice I always give my students, you start with the obvious things. You start by, picking out major themes. You start by picking out, well, how, if there's a verse pattern, if there's, rhyme, how are those things functioning? That really it might seem kind of boring or obvious or sort of dumb in a way, but starting with those basic building blocks would be the way to do it, I would suggest. There's other versions of this. So you might, in reading a passage or a poem or a bit of a play, there might be something that you as you read, you think, well, hang on a second, what's that? What's going on there? Something that kind of snags on your mind, so to speak. So if there's something where you think, actually, I don't understand what's going on there, then maybe you start with the moment of confusion, trying to work out, well, maybe it's something where you think, oh, I love that line, but I don't know why. Or I thought that line was horrible, that really kind of jarred with me. Or it might be just some sort of gesture the writer makes where you think, oh, I've never seen anyone do that before. That's interesting. So that might be another place to start.
Thank you, that's helpful. Another question about the poems. Could you expand further on the lengths of lines in both poems? And the person who's asked the question suggested, is it used to represent both poets' infatuation or their thought process or something else?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think possibly. So this isn't a very Pratt-critty answer, but I think there is a kind of contextual thing here, which is that they're both American poets. American poetry has a kind of tendency to long lines. And there's lots of sort of slightly specious arguments about, it's a big country, so you need a big line, that kind of stuff. But I think if any of you are familiar with Walt Whitman, Walt Whitman, a poet whose line is so long that his poems start to look like prose, right? There's something of that inheritance. And I think, as I said, it's that sense of expansiveness. It might be a sense of a certain kind of optimism or a certain kind of egotism, on the other hand. But it's also, I think, it could be about enthusiasm or about a certain kind of desire, right? A sort of reaching out to something. Again, it seems to me possible that it's actually slightly different in each poem, so that there's a kind of meandering quality to them more. It's a poem about not quite knowing what to write, I think, amongst other things. Whereas I think the Ahara, it's that sort of sense of ease, that sense of, one of the things that's most incredible to me about Ahara is how he makes his poems look totally effortless, like he's not trying, but he is trying. It's actually quite hard to write a poem as good as Frank Ahara writes poems. But that sort of sense of laxity, or of like just being laid back, being a cool guy.
Thanks, Brendan. I think we're going to have to end it there, actually, because it's 11:30 and our students are here to do the student Q&A section of the day. There are so many more questions, though, which shows that people have been really interested in this. Lots of interesting questions on the poems themselves. So thank you, Brendan.